So, our discussion of colonialism in Japan is really going to focus on the Japanese insular attitude. We find that the Japanese, when dealing with outsiders, weren't too keen on it, actually. It led to a lot of dissension in the region because they weren't even really very friendly with other Asian cultures at this time. So they had a tendency to not want to deal with outsiders, right, to a great extent. They wanted to basically have, their own control over their own identity and movements. And so they'll find sort of outside influence to be something that they sort of chafe against. And we'll also talk about, of course, the Japanese influence on European art and the trade of Japanese prints and how that affects style in Europe. So to show you a little bit about this idea of outsiders and the Japanese dislike of them, I wanted to show you this print by Sadahide called Foreigners in Yokohama. And I gave you some information about the important events that happened in the 1800s with the US and Japan. And many people frame these events as when Japan is opened, might we say. And this is done by the US Commodore Matthew Perry showing up in 1853 and basically forcing trade, in a sense, upon the Japanese with outside entities, right? Again, the US, of course, being primary, but other Western entities as well. This was viewed as a forced thing, and so you'll notice that they weren't real happy about Americans and called them white barbarians and such. And it really sets up some of the tensions you see between the US and Japan moving forward. Um, the Japanese had been trading some with Europe, but again, they viewed it somewhat as a choice on their part. And so when this opening happens, they view it as something that is then being determined for them. And I would say, putting mandates on people sometimes doesn't work so well for you, and it didn't work here with the Japanese attitude towards outsiders. In the piece by Sadahide, it's like we're on a street in Yokohama and we're seeing these foreigners and the stereotypes that the Japanese are attaching to them. The man inside is a British man, so he represents sort of the idea of European colonialism. And you'll notice he's looking out the window at another person who at first you might say, well, are they Japanese? No, they are not. They're actually Chinese. And the way that you can know that is that they're holding a duck in the bag down below them. And if you know anything about China, a Peking duck is their classic, hallmark dish. So having them carry around a duck with them, basically identified them in the Japanese mind as Chinese. And you'll notice that these two are sort of looking at each other almost with sort of apprehension. And so the Japanese are like, we're apprehensive towards these outsiders in general. And then the tension they bring into our region, we don't appreciate either. So again, colonialism was something that was definitely a hot button issue in the 1800s with the Japanese. But as I mentioned, trade begins to go to really blossom in earnest between Europe and Japan. And a lot of it is through the arts. Those prints we looked at, the Hokusai prints, and here you're seeing a Hiroshige print. Hiroshige was also a very, very well-known printmaker in Japan. A lot of these prints start to be traded out to Europe. They cost the amount of a bowl of rice in Japan, but they were also very cheap when they made it to a European market. Because printmaking, as we talked about, is able to make multiples. You're able to have a lot of these pieces. And it's not a unique object like a painting. So they are much more affordable. And you'll note that when the Japanese objects start to arrive in European markets, the artists there are influenced by them. So I'm showing you kind of a one-to-one example with a Van Gogh painting in the Hiroshige print. And you'll notice that Van Gogh is directly lifting the Hiroshige setup, the concept, the subject matter, the look, and transferring it to his post-impressionist style. And what we find is that the most impact of Japonism, right, or the Japanese style, right, in Europe is on Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. So Van Gogh was a Post-Impressionist. You're looking at a Degas pastel on the left here, and he was an Impressionist. And then you're looking at a Japanese print that many think probably inspired, right, the look of the Degas work. And so we often look at like these, Degas pastels or Van Gogh paintings, right, and we compare them to printmaking sources and often see a lot of relevance between the poses, the flatness or the 2D look of the imagery, and also the use of color seems to be very inspired by the Japanese look of prints. And so, again, Japonism, to me, that's a very interesting style to consider. And it really exists alongside chinoiserie. Chinoiserie really arrived in the 1700s, and Japonism is more the 1800s in Europe. But again, they're all about this sort of exoticism of outside style and outside technique, and how can you kind of blend it into European art making. I, of course, also want to talk to you about contemporary art. And the two areas that I use here, two subjects I use to frame contemporary art, are the discussion of identity and also Zen as an inspiration for art making. And so these are the two concepts I use to sort of guide our discussion of contemporary Japanese art making. Just like China, there's a lot going on here. It's a very hot market in the contemporary art world, and I think that they're producing some very interesting artists as well. So to talk about identity, I wanted to show you first Roger Shimomura. And Shimomura is interesting to discuss because he's actually a Japanese American artist. He was born in America, so you'll notice it's Roger Shimomura. And why I love talking about his work is because as a Japanese American, he actually was part of the Japanese internment that happened during World War II. He was a small child at the time, and a lot of his work is focalized around that experience. And he said it was very important to his identity, right? How he began to understand himself as both an American and someone of Japanese descent. And he said he often had to reconcile those two things in his mind, and that his time in the internment camp really taught him that, he was considered almost alien, like an outsider, and that he sort of carried that with him for the rest of his life. In these works, what he does is document his time at the Minnetonka internment camp. And this was a camp in Idaho where about 9,000 people were interred during World War II. And one of the things he said he wanted to do was sort of mix his everyday life experiences with a Japanese look and a style. So if you look at the pieces, you'll notice they have a very printmaking aesthetic. They look very similar to like what a Hokusai or a Hiroshige print would look like. The same kind of 2D-ness, same use of color. But he's documenting, right, events from the camp. And I got to meet Mr. Shimomura. During my graduate school days, I got to go out to the University of Kansas a couple different times to do some presenting. When you're in graduate school, you apply to go to conferences and present papers. And they're known for having a very important conference. So I went out there 2 times, right, to present papers. And during my time there, I got to meet Mr. Shimomura and talk to him about his life, his work, right? And one of the quotes he said to me was, "When you change the joke, you slip the yoke." And I thought that was a very striking comment, that you can either let your past define you in a way that is negative, or you can find a way to reframe it where it can become instructional and the pain can kind of slip away. If you change the way you approach it, then you can slip the yoke, or you can slip the prison of it, perhaps, to create something that's powerful and gives empowerment to people, not brings you down. And so he talked a lot about how these works are meant to have a hint of comedy to them and almost humor to them about a very serious situation. And so in this piece, for instance, he basically talks about how it looks like a typical print. It almost even looks like the setup looks like a Japanese screen. If you've ever seen the screens that Japanese and Chinese people use in their homes. He says the look kind of has that traditional look to it, but you look at the subject matter and it's, the camp with people walking around in it and this surveillance happening on both sides, watching them and their activities. And he said, I wanted to make these informative works about my time there and show people what that was about while using a very traditional Japanese look, using my heritage to talk about the history that had happened. He also does works like this where he says a lot of them are about his experiences of feeling this otherness or this outsiderness classmates, they look like the same type of girl, right? Same dress, same basic posing, basic attitude, until you realize there's barbed wire fence between them, where the Japanese girls in the camp and the Caucasian girls outside of it. The one on the right is particularly striking because it comes from his own personal stories of being in high school and dating. They were living in San Francisco at the time, his family, and he said that he started to date, a white, blonde, blue-eyed girl. And that one day he said, "Well, let me walk you to your house. I'll walk you home." And she was like, "Oh no, you won't. You'll leave me right here on this corner, and I'm gonna go home, and you're gonna leave." She said, "If my father sees me with you, you'll see a shotgun, right? My dad won't like that I'm dating a Japanese American. That's not okay." So he said later when he thought about conceiving of this piece, he made both of them into caricatures, both of them into almost like these comic book versions of themselves. And if you know anything about the way that the Japanese were sort of stereotyped visually during the World War II time period, they were meant to look very, very yellow, slanty eyes, right, big teeth. It was the way that they were stereotyped in visuals. And so he said, I wanted to use that stereotype, that visual, but I also stereotyped her. I made her into this very waspy, very white porcelain, bright, blonde hair. She almost looks like if you've seen the Roy Lichtenstein women and Roy Lichtenstein's works about comics. She looks like that. So he's like, I took both of us to extremes because we were real people, but I wanted you to think about the stereotyping of our positions against one another and how that can be read through identity as well. And he works a lot, he was coming of age as an artist, right? Really at the end of the 60s into the 70s and the 80s. He's an older man now. And he uses a lot of like the spirit of the 1960s and the spirit of pop culture. So if you look at the pop cultural movement of the 1960s in reference to art, you have like Andy Warhol, the Marilyn you see here, you have Roy Lichtenstein, Tom Weisselman. These were the pop artists of the time, and they used a lot of comics and consumer goods and celebrity imagery and such. So a lot of his works, you'll notice he's sort of blending together traditional Japanese-looking imagery, like the samurai, with again, pop iconography. Or on the right, he's using the Great Wave and kind of the idea of the traditional Japanese dress, but you have the smiley faces all over the robe. So I love his work. I think it's very informative about not just Japanese culture, but American culture because he is Japanese American. Also, I want to show you Tomoka Sawada. This is a Japanese artist where she started doing works in the early 2000s when she was still in art school. She started to do these works about identity as framing, might we say. And this is some of my favorite type of work. I'm very interested in the idea of like identity as framing. Like how do we define our identity through the visual symbols we send out to other people? Like I joke with my class, like, when I'm teaching an in-person class, if I would like, would you take me seriously if I showed up in my pajamas? We have an expectation of certain people in certain roles looking a certain way, even though the knowledge in my head is exactly the same, right? And this is why I think sometimes it's interesting when I teach Zoom classes. Like, I just wear like a regular T-shirt and really don't wear a lot of makeup, and I'm like, I wonder if students think that's a problem. But I'm like, I'm in my house, I'm teaching on Zoom, so I'm sorry, I'm not going to that much effort, for like an hour on a Zoom call. So it's funny that I view that differently than being in person with people. So there's these layers to me about presentation and expectation, right? And she plays with that. And again, I'm a real fan of thinking about like how we image ourselves to others. How does that, create our sense of their identity? So when she was first starting out, she didn't have a lot of money. So what she did is she actually would go in these little photo booths. You find them all over Japan. They're in subways. They're everywhere where it's that you put a couple coins in or a couple dollars in, right, and it takes a strip of photographs for you. She would take this whole kit of like costumes and makeup and accessories, and she would keep like changing her hairstyles or changing her look, putting on different wigs or pulling her hair back, putting on different clothes. And she said that she was very interested in this idea of the archetypes of a Japanese woman or the archetypes of a look and how that could be presented to you. So she sort of filters through all these different looks. When she started to get some recognition for this work and started to get a little bit more money, right, in a gallery, a budget, she started to do more professional photo shoots where she started to use, again, these stereotypes of Japanese women or girls. These are ones that deal with like the Harajuku girls. So in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, there was a whole sort of wave of sort of pop culture about these Harajuku girls, as they were called in Japan. And the Harajuku girls were known for their wild, colorful, outrageous fashion. And so she, in the strip on the left, is her kind of dressing as various different Harajuku girls, as she put it. It's all her. It's all her with different makeup, costuming, whatever. And then on the right, it's her dealing with the fashion in the 2000s of like Japanese tanning, and then wearing these like this crazy blue eyeshadow, this frosted blue eyeshadow, almost this idea of like how to look Western. She put it. So she was like, obviously it looks super ridiculous, but she said the Harajuku girls and the tanning thing. She said it's really about a ridiculous look. And she said, I wonder sometimes if Japanese, we have this very insular attitude. It's very sort of internal culture, which makes us sort of rebel a lot, so that the youth of Japan, kind of go to these extremes with their fashion because of feeling this tradition pushing down on them. And I thought that was an interesting thing for her to explore. And again, I love this idea. It's always her, just, again, re-encapsulated through fashion, through wigs, through makeup, through presentation or posing, and she becomes different people. So this idea that we're not just us, that's an internal mechanism, but what we can be to other people can fluctuate through various different cycles. She then started to even get a little bit more serious, where she started to look at like, as she put it, sort of the two sides of Japanese women, the private and the public. And she said, if you look at the public face of Japanese women, it always sort of focuses on um, tradition, restraint. Up until quite recently, women had to walk like two steps behind men in Japan. They were considered subservient. And she's like, it's taken a lot to shake off that geisha identity of the woman as a pretty flowery thing, someone there to please, someone there to entertain, the courtesan role. She's like, but if you really look at like our private women, she talks about the porn industry, pornography in general. She goes, there is some wild shit you'll see. She's like, so this idea that like, oh, you want, um, the lady in the streets and the freak in the bed, she said, to quote Usher, she said that that's a very Japanese thing. And again, it speaks to her a lot about Japanese identity, like show restraint on the surface, but under the surface, it's a little wild and frisky and out of control. And I won't go into the proclivities of Japanese sexuality. You can Google it for yourself, but there's some stuff that should make you go, woo, oh, wow. I'll just say octopus and leave it there. But again, I think she's trying to get into these mechanisms of presentation, identity, and especially for her in reference to gender, right, and gender identity.